And I'm going to be sort of giving you the warm up to this session. And I'm going to start with something really, really basic, but really important. And this comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Higher education shall be equally accessible to all. That is a super powerful statement, and one that we really have to keep in mind as, you know, the accessibility to higher education is a human right, and we have to work to support that. And I'm not just talking about people throughout the world where they just don't, it's not available to them. It's not, the technology is not available to them, for example. But I also want you to think about how it's not available to people in our own country. And that's part of the driving force behind my interest in OER, because I'm very passionate about rural education. And I'm finding that OER is so important to all students, but the difference that it's made in the lives of rural students, really, really important. There are some very key things when designing for OER. And you're designing for access. And what I mean by that is the removal of the financial barriers that often come with it, the physical barriers, anything that's going to impede that access. Design for agency. And that's so both the teacher and the student have increased control in the content. And it's amazing, I have found in my own experience, how much students want to be part of the contribution to the content. Also, design for ownership. You can edit constantly if you wish, and that text can go on in perpetuity, which is actually really exciting. The design for participation, and that's that likelihood for collaboration and participation and engagement that I know every single instructor is looking to achieve. And with that is designed for experience. And that's to make your materials engaging and interesting, and very quickly kind of hook your students on it. Now, in terms of awareness is a very big deal. These are some pretty frightening statistics. Textbook costs have increased 1,000%. 1,000%, that's almost unthinkable, since the 1970s, and have risen 88% between 06 and 16. These are alarming numbers. And if you yourself are not buying these books, or are exposed to a large group of people buying textbooks, or even one person buying textbooks, that may not just dawn on you normally. So think about that. Textbook costs have risen more than the average rate of inflation, which is wild. Here's something that I think is particularly sad. Since COVID, e-textbook prices have increased up to 500% more than counterpart print materials. And that, to me, is putting up a huge barrier for our students. And that is, and I just think it's out and out price gouging. So again, the importance of our open resources. And this is really interesting. And it was through the National Association for College Stores, found this data. And obviously tuition is always going to be the largest life expense that students have, but housing, food, living expenses, and transportation are behind the percentage of tuition and course materials. in the student's total life expenses. That is huge. So what exactly is OER? And these are the teaching and learning and research resources that they're in the public domain or they are released under an intellectual property license that permits no cost access, use, adaptation, redistribution, and those things that I just talked about no cost, the use, the adaptation, those really run into the 5 R's. And I'm not going to go through them all because basically one can see them. But the whole idea is, you as an author can retain your own rights and control how your work is distributed. The reuse part is amazing. That's your way of sharing. Revising is allowing others to make modifications and then and alter the original content, make new content. It also comes into remixing like that, and that whole redistribution, that whole sharing, that's really what it's all about. And I know that my co-presenters, Lee and Brian, are going to spend a lot of time talking about some of these things. But just the facts. Here's some more things that unless you're really in tune with or know students, you might not realize these things. Really, contemporary students are working a lot. They're full-time students in many cases, and there's no way that they can make it on 10 hours a week, which used to be the standard work rate for students. In Kansas, these are our own students. College students are working between 28 and 33 hours a week on the average to be able to live and finance their education. That is a lot, that is very taxing on a student. We know that loan debt just goes up and up and up, and it has tripled since '06. And it's the lower and middle income students that are most affected. Kansas students are told to budget approximately $2,000 a year for their books. Kansas students are actually spending $500 a year on books. And you're asking, why the disparity? How can that possibly be? Well, I'll tell you about the disparity, and there's something that I'm going to share with you that's a little on the disturbing side. Many students don't have the funds to buy all the required textbooks. So they do everything from not buying them to holding out on buying them to sharing them, hoping there's an old version of the text in the library. And all of that equals to students not doing well. They are taking fewer classes. They are not registering for the courses that they need. And in the most dramatic cases, they're dropping out. And that's something that we can't afford for our students to do. It's too important for all of us to keep an educated community turning into an educated workforce. Now, this is the part, the first time I heard this really blew me away. The textbook cost issue is such a big deal that there are actual plasma banks that are on campus marketing to students. This is an actual legit ad that is placed on a campus. And it's saying, need textbooks, donate your plasma. So they are literally, giving their lifeblood to be able to buy and often finance their educations and buy their textbooks. I don't think that we really want our students doing that. That's it's not as uncommon. This has always existed, maybe not for this purpose, but it's just something that I think we can move ahead of. Now, here's the big selling point. When you use OER, there's some really cool things that happen. The University of Georgia in 2018 found out that their Pell eligible students showed a really large increase in the courses with OER materials, like almost 11%. That is a big jump. And they were a little more than 4% less likely to earn a D, an F, or a W in an OER textbook course. For non-Pell eligible students, their grades were up almost 7%, and they were less likely to earn a D, F, or W by about 2%. And the bottom line is there really is no, and there's plenty of research to support this, there's really no difference in the learning efficacy between open textbooks and commercial textbooks. It's not as if we're giving our students something less, we're actually giving them something more. Good for students, good for higher education. Students save money. There are no access codes, which in my life, that would be one of the greatest gifts I could give to my students, because access codes are an ongoing problem. There's no expiration date on materials, and those are all amazing things. It works for the instructors as well. They don't need to gain permission or to pay to use a given resource. That resource is theirs to work with. An unlimited number of students can have the resource and not worry about any kind of copyright infringement or not being able to afford the book. It's all of that goes away. And OER materials are easily adaptable to what student needs. You don't have to write your own textbook. Most faculty members that I know when I was faculty, I did this. You're writing a lot of handouts, a lot of materials for your student. That's OER, and that's what's part of this. You can adapt it, you can grow it, and that adaptability, it really is so convenient for the wide range of pedagogies and teaching methods and curriculum that rapidly changes. And everyone in that learning process can be included for content additions, updates, improvements. And I think that's wonderful, because I think it gives the student a huge chance to grow. That puts an end to my part of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Lee Miller.
Thanks, Stephanie. My name is Lee Miller. Welcome. I'm the Director of Innovation and Compliance at Barton Community College, and I'm going to talk just a little bit around awareness, and awareness specifically around two topics, inclusive access and equity initiatives that can correlate with open education initiatives. And so that's where we're going to start in terms of inclusive access. And one of the things that I just want to highlight here before I get started is in no way, shape, or form am I trying to demonize publishers. So I think there's a space that's someplace, in the middle where publishers, open education communities, and instructors or institutions can come together, where we can work on trying to make education more affordable and accessible at some point in time. With that, we do still have to recognize what is currently happening and what our publishers providing. And that's just what this conversation is literally an awareness to find out if this is something that's going to work for you, how it may work for you, and how it may not work for you, just so you know some of this information. So when we look at inclusive access and what is inclusive access, it really is a textbook sales model that ends up embedding the cost of textbooks actually in the tuition and fees. So it ends up being behind the scenes where some students may not necessarily see it. And it's also called AKA automatic textbook billing. So you may see that term out there too. Now there's several different types depending on the publisher where you see a lot of different names, and here's just a small few. And if you notice, the terminology that they're using is very much in line with some of the open education terms that we have just talked about in terms of affordability, access, and equity initiatives that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And one of the things I'm going to highlight a lot of in parallel, some of the things I'm going to correlate what Tiffany talked about within open education and correlate that here throughout what we're seeing with inclusive access and some of the problems that that may create. But this is just a graph of actually something that she noted with the college textbooks versus inflation. And it really shows a picture demonstration of what it is that we're talking about here. And you can notice during the COVID time and how it's starting to rise a little bit in 2021, this is what we're talking about. So when looking at how does this inclusive access model work? I've taken this is the resource I've used down there at the bottom, but I've broken this up into kind of 3 points just to highlight. And so the first one is the agreement that happens between the institution, possibly the bookstore, and the publisher. And if you notice, there's only really 3 stakeholders in that conversation. And we'll look at more at what this agreement may or contract may include, but really not looking at the additional stakeholders that may be involved. And publishers really do target decision makers when having these conversations. And so that's something important to note. Additionally, it's also really focused, as you saw in many of the names, that looking at the first day access, where that's something within open education that we can also provide through that model, and it is through a learning management system most of the time. And again, this is digital content. Most of the publishers' information now is going digital. And then last but not least, they provide this option where students have a period to opt out. And we're really going to look at that more as is that what perception is that in terms of they have an option, but do they really? And so as we move on, here's some of the challenges that we look at when we look at what the model is, and then how does it integrate in comparison to what we're trying to do with OER. And the first one is attempting to reduce costs. And I would say in some cases, publishers may be trying to reduce costs when it's compared to print textbooks. So when we look at digital versus rental, those are usually comparable among publishers. And then in recognition to like a cost comparison for the next point, it's 2 to 4 times cheaper than a print textbook. So it's really not even giving necessarily students an option to print the text or to buy a print textbook that they may own just because of the cost comparison. And that's, with buyer behavior type of aspects that you could go and correlate into that. But with this, it's also reducing book buyback options. So the cost comparison where we used to be able to go and compare costs, find out where can we find a used textbook, those sort of things. Those things are starting to go away where they don't have that option anymore to do that because some publishers are removing the option to buy print. And so you can't find older editions. You always have to buy the new one. And then we move into this opting out conversation, and it's really twofold conversation. So the first part I'm going to talk about is bundling. So when we talk about a digital version of a text, a lot of times publishers will also take that digital text and correlate assessments or assignments or other type of package deal with that the instructor can then take both aspects in and integrate that into the course. And that's what they refer to as bundling, the assignment assessment aspect in addition to the textbook. And so what happens is on the one side, this idea of opting out with just the textbook, the students, if they do opt out, there's no other place for them to get that textbook if there's no other print options or older editions for what they're trying to learn. In addition, if we add that bundling concept to this conversation, now we're having where if they opt out, they literally have no access within their LMS to get access to their assignments or assessments. So this conversation in terms of perception that is being presented really becomes an opting in or a dropping out conversation when we start talking about student success conversations. Again, I've mentioned this just briefly, but the aspect of just content ownership. I still have from my college days content or books that were from what I used in college, and I used different ones throughout my college career that I had saved previously, just knowing what my major was. And students no longer have that option, as a lot of the content after the course is done, the digital content will disappear, obviously depending on the access or the access codes. It can also limit faculty control over content depending on the agreements or the contracts agreed upon in the institution. Again, this is where talking with all stakeholders is really, really valuable. So you can find out what those choices are and make sure that it's going to be good for everybody involved. And that leads us to a conversation around institutional contracts or agreements. And again, I'm summarizing here. This may not be for all, and different things may change over a period of time, but many allow for price increases. And maybe not even necessarily a definition of how that would be, or a cap on what that may be. And then it may hold an institution responsible if a percentage is met. So the reason why publishers can provide a reduced cost for these inclusive access programs is because they are depending on a high quantity of these digital textbooks being sold. So a lot of times in those agreements, they will have a certain percentage that needs to be met. And so if they have students that do opt out, the institution may be held responsible for whatever isn't met. And then stats for student textbook purchases. Again, the publisher is getting the benefit. And so I'm going to highlight what Tiffany just mentioned earlier, and note that this was a 2018 survey done for students. And if you note, they ask, has the cost of required textbook caused you to do any of the following? And these, they could pick any of these and multiple choice. So they could pick several of them. But if you notice, the top one is 64% said they did at some point in time not purchase a textbook. So when you look at the previous slide that we just talked about, where institutions may be held responsible for certain percentages of textbooks not purchased, even if they are digital, we're looking at publishers currently getting about 30 to 40% of the current student population in some contexts of actually buying textbooks. So this really is a large publisher benefit of integrating this into the institution without necessarily any additional sales or marketing or anything like that. And so with that, we're moving on into the equity initiative conversation. And that's just where we parallel beyond access and affordability, and how can this literally be integrated to further equity initiatives. And these are just two examples. So we're looking at the first one is Open Textbooks for Africa. And this is looking at what I believe started with an OpenStax astronomy textbook that's associated with the Northern Hemisphere, but they took this and adapted it for the Southern Hemisphere so that it's much easier for the students in Africa to study the context in which they are reading about, and also what they see in the night sky, and which is obviously really, really important. And likewise, so that's kind of a demonstration of just knowledge base and applying, but this other one is culturally based. And so looking at the introduction to sociology, even though both of these are in North America, Canada has very specific cultural differences than different areas of North America. And so they want to highlight that so that it resonates with their student population. Again, looking at, Tiffany highlighted many of the student issues, especially around, insecurities around food and housing and some stuff like that. And so this is one of those areas that, again, is that equity initiative that can be assessed, where we do consider student issues, because when we help save students money in one area, the opportunity for them to shift that money to take care of other needs is going to be really valuable. And Sarah Goldberg-Robb is one person that does do a lot of research in the negative effects of how the increase of college costs does impact students. And these are two of those areas, food and housing insecurities. Likewise, she highlighted some of the drop, withdrawal, and fail rates, and where that significantly impacts marginalized communities, especially when we layer that in context to the highlight of where those student loans come in, where some of them, whether they have or do not have a degree, will still have to pay back those loans. And that's making sure where those that start college can complete college so that they have a higher opportunity to increase their living wage, et cetera. And so what it really comes down to is that students need to Maslow before they can bloom. That's really looking at the Maslow hierarchy of needs in comparison to the Bloom's taxonomy that we use for instruction. And then last but not least, this is equity through OER. And this is just one resource, which we have on a resource for you at the end of this session that we were dropping in the chat. And you can also find it on our in Sketch. But it's equity through OER. And if you notice at the bottom, they do have components of the rubric that do correlate with leadership aspects, as well as practitioners, instructors, and then the students, of course, as well. And so I'm actually going to do a brief introduction on this part for incentivizing program or incentivizing and program initiatives, just as a community college perspective. And so for us at Barton, we don't have the financing to be able to provide monetary incentives. And so one of the things that we did looking at that was recognizing the recognition of that for one, but short-term versus long-term goals, and how can we set up something that's going to be sustainable? And so what we did in terms of providing, a motivation factor behind that is really focus on the support that we provide faculty and focus on instructional goals and pedagogical benefits for what faculty can do with OER and open pedagogy practices, as well as the student benefits. And so for people like myself, as well as the center I work within, Center of Innovation and Excellence, we support that work so faculty can do and move to that transition. And so far, we've had Barton faculty have transitioned 62 courses up to date, and we've saved roughly about $2,000 or $200,000 for student savings up to this point, which I've been really, really excited about. So building a culture of open education is really what we're trying to do and increase that motivation through the support that we provide. So that's a community college perspective, and I will shift it over to Brian to provide a university.
Yes, so my name is Brian Linshield. I am a professor at Kent State University in nutrition department, and I, along with my colleague, Andy Bennett, and a colleague in the library at the time, helped to found the Open Alternative Textbook Initiative that we have here. And so I'm going to share some of what our experience has been about, but I highlighted on the slide that we did write an article about this. And so I'll share some brief things, but if you want more detail, you can read about it in the article. To Matthew's question, and maybe we can address that later, they were not supportive, of this when we started, I guess some things. And so that was something that we did have to kind of work around and strategize in order to be able to overcome. So, okay, Lee, can you go next one? So what we decided to do is we modeled ourselves after Temple and UMass at the time that we started this had some programs where they provide grants to faculty members to adopt, adapt, or primarily create at that time, since there was not a lot of adapting because there wasn't much available. Open or alternative educational resources. So we're very big in the OER, but at the time we started, getting people to think outside the textbook was a real win. You know what I mean? And so alternative textbooks was something that's not openly available or does not fit the open licenses that hopefully you are familiar with or you've learned about at the summit. If not, there's some sessions that we can direct you to, you know what I mean, to help make that definition come more real to you. And so those two universities were providing smaller grant dollars, like $1,000 to $200,000 to $1,000 to $2,000 grants. But we looked at their programs and what sort of courses they were reporting on being able to make this transition, and they were getting like small courses, and so not like the big enrollment courses that we're most interested in, where you see the most benefit. And so we set up our program to have a higher grant value that we provide. So it was somewhere from $2,000 to $5,000 is how we structured it. And so some of that depends on what the return on investment is going to be in that resource and what they're going to do, and things on what sort of value they get. More people get towards the higher end than the lower end. I guess I'd say that we've seen over time as far as how we do provide these out. We have seen a very high return on investment. That's what the ROI is that you see there. And so that's been something that we've been able to try to maximize or be able to build upon. And so one of the things that we did have that was exciting last year is we were Kansas State University's all-in cause. And so for one day, one cause event. And so they raised over $500,000 for us to use, in our program and things. So that's what you see this figure representing here. And there's a link about that on the left-hand side. Okay, let me go next one. So as far as being able to, we also have a course fee, in addition to those grants. And so this was something that came a little bit later. We started with the grants first. We started to see a decrease in our grant applications. And some of that goes back to something I'll share on a couple slides as far as what we started to hear when we went out and tried to learn more from our original awardees and kind of what their experience has been like. So we put in a course fee, and so there's details about the course fee in the link down there that we'll share in the presentation if you want it. But basically, it has to be a course that needs course materials first. And so if it is like an archery course and it's clearly like an activity-based course where you would not expect there, to be course materials related to that, that's not one that we're wanting to have the fee on. But then beyond that, for us, it needs to be no required or recommended course materials that have to be purchased. So we're trying to make sure there's no costs, the students as far as the fee goes. Okay, next one's Lee. So as far as how it works for us, it's a $10 per course fee. And so how we describe it on more simple terms to the external audience to understand this is there's a $10 fee, $9 goes back to the department or unit that teaches that course. And so most of it goes back to wherever the course is being taught. $1 goes back to the initiative. And so we can utilize that to put back out as grants that we do to continue to support the uptake of open alternative educational resources. The actual is 89% to the unit department, 9% the initiative, and 2% the bad debt. And so that's part of just the nature of how this works at an institution that not everybody pays. And so that's where the bad debt part comes in. And so as far as when we were going through getting this set up, part of what this was, we have a lot of discussions about internal reallocations here at my institution. And so I term this as this is an external reallocation. So we are externally reallocating some money that's going to publishers and we're putting back, into the institution in this case. And we're going to try to do that while also lowering student cost. And so part of when we went to go talk to our student government leaders at this point in time, I said, I know this doesn't sound totally logical, but I think we could save more students money with this fee through greater uptake and use of OER than if this fee did not exist. Okay, next slide, Lee. So this slide shows a little bit on what the change has been for us. And so the gray lines here are showing the initial flow. And so this is how we typically were approaching people with just our grant model, where we would have announcements, meeting sessions. We would try to get to a faculty member instructor. They would need to go to their department head and deans to try to secure support, for them to do this, I guess, and things. And then if they were found support, they were unhappy with what they were doing, they were nonconformists and just did not want to stay with publishing, textbooks and things, and they want to do something, then they would put in an application. When we put the fee in, now all of a sudden we have meetings and sessions that are directed at department heads and deans, I guess, to say, listen, this is something that you can do that helps students. It'll also help return some funding and support to your department. And so we were able to start to shift that. And so part of the reason why we did this was that when we went out and did some focus groups with our original awardees, they reported a lack of support from department head, dean level, kind of repeatedly, and things saying that people where there's not support from people that I do this, they didn't value, what I was doing. And so we put this fee in place partly in order to be able to do that. And so I put down there the link at the bottom of this slide is to the research that was with that group. And so there's focus group information you can see there is kind of related to that. Okay, next slide, Lee. So as far as we do this, we do have course marking. And so this is what our course mark looks like currently. It might change a little bit here in the not too distant future if we get things approved. But this is something that we came up with. And so this is what it looks like in our course catalog on top. And then what it looks like in the enrollment system is more on the bottom down there on the right-hand side is what it looks like. That's what they see. And so this is something that when they go in and make their decisions that they can see, whether the course uses an open alternative resource or not. And so whether they can expect that. We also typically have the hyperlink off there, taking them to a page to explain why, what this is and so what it represents. And we have a chapter that's about the making of our course marking logo and how the course marking works for us. That's at the bottom of this slide too. And so put a link to that. Okay, next one, Lee. So what we're building towards ideally is changing the culture and norms from currently the norm is, the question from one faculty member instructor to another is what textbook do you use as a course you teach is kind of the general sort of culture or norm. We're trying to change it to, what resources do you use to teach your course with ideally OER being a primary option, it's being considered is what we're driving towards. Okay, next one, Lee. So some other topics we're going to touch on quickly. So we recognize the current status or context, that we're all operating in. And so this is an article from the Chronicle of Higher Ed, the Great Faculty Disengagement. And so part of what we want to encourage you is to, still move forward with these things. Try to work with the people who have an interest in the mindset and the capacity in order to be able to engage with this, and know that you are working within this, and it's not just you, if this is kind of the feeling that you're seeing at your specific institution. Okay, Lee, next one. The next one is OER is not a fad. So I created my open educational resource in 2009. And so over a decade, ago that it's been available. And so it's been something that I've continued to use throughout all that time. And so it's something that's only growing. The open alternative textbook initiative I talked about started in 2013. We're getting close to a decade, our 10-year. And so we're starting to plan, for what that's going to look like and things. And so we're saving students millions annually. And so it's something that definitely is having a great impact. And I don't know if we have another slide or not, Lee. I think we're done, right? So I think we're ready to answer questions. And so we have Matthews. I know they already put in the chat, as far as say to a decision maker does not support already, or is even against it, to convince them that OER is a good idea. In my case, Matthew, since I referenced that was kind of the context that, we were in when I started. We found people that were supportive, and in our case, it happened to be the students had access to a certain portion of the student fee dollars, and we went to them and we explained what we wanted to do, and they gave us some pilot funding that we used to show that this was something that was very successful and that we could do. And then, when we showed that, then the administrators started to listen and pay attention. You know what I mean? To say, wow, this is something that seems like is a really good idea and we should be supporting. And it got to be so positive that our president at the time actually left and went to another institution. And you can figure that out if you draw, directions. But I can tell you, when he went to the other institution, he reached back, you know what I mean? And he had like some of his people that were below him to say, I would like to do something like what we were doing at K-State, you know what I mean? My new institution and things. And it was more difficult for them to get that established, because it depends a little bit on whether you have the people there who are valuing that and things. And we happen to have been building a culture for a while where that's something that has happened here. Lee, you have anything? Tiffany?
I would really focus on that listening aspect. I would ask what is the holdup that the decision maker has? Like, what challenges are they facing? Because from their perspective, they may be having a few issues that can be easily cleared up, but you don't know necessarily where they're coming from. So listening first and finding out what that is, and then you can prepare around that, and just having those conversations, I found to be the easiest way to do it.
And quickly from my end, I have just always learned to maybe come with too many facts, but when you come with hard data in your presentation, it's very hard to argue with success. And that's what I've always been very fortunate to be able to bring to my board, for example, because my board had no knowledge, no extensive knowledge about OER, and had no idea what it was, why we should bring it to Colby. And with some storytelling and a lot of facts, it quickly became a very popular topic, not one to be so dreaded and feared, because I think there was fear because they didn't understand it and just kind of distanced themselves. But facts really help a lot when you're making your case.
Well, and I would highlight that storytelling piece, because we just had a great, if you haven't seen the keynote, we had a great student presentation. So when these all get published for the summit, go back and look at that student presentation from the